Computer. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Rising Tide Foundation today. We have a wonderful presentation awaiting us with the Mr. Anton Chaitkin, somewhat a legend in the field of American politics and in the field of American history and statecraft. This man is responsible for writing many, many books on a subject which is dear to many of us Westerners. We are looking at an American empire or an American nation right now, struggling with its identity, struggling with its vision of the future. And there is a great battle taking place in our culture right now for the future. I would like to take a moment here just to share my screen so I can show you all the most important book that first of all, I'll introduce myself. This is me in Kenya. My name is Nicholas Jones. I am a dance teacher. I am a ballet professional, former dancer of 15 years for all of you who don't know who I am. This is what I do in Africa. I teach young children to learn ballet, and the future for us is to potentially make an Academy of the Arts. So that's me. And to get back to Mr. Chaitkin, I would like to share with you his book. Just give me 2 seconds. This is volume 2 of Who We Are, the second chapter or the second volume of from the first book that I already have on my shelf, and I'm sure many of you do as well. This book will be released soon. It contains over 600 pages of valuable research, some of the greatest research we'll find on American history. And for anybody looking to understand and to be able to navigate what we're about to live through, I would suggest that everybody read Anton Chaitkin's work and take the time to indulge in it and fill yourself up with all the knowledge. And without any further ado, I present to you Mr. Anton Chaitkin. Anton.
Thank you, Nick. I guess I'll go back from this. I'd like to see the people. Well, I guess we can leave that on.
Yes.
Oh, that looks good. That's fine. I don't know. Yeah, we're getting these pictures of people.
Yes. Would you like to now?
Okay. Yeah, there we go. All right. So thank you for coming into this virtual meeting. I know some things that others don't know. Knowledge that I believe is vital for intelligent participation in today's world events. I just have a little introduction, then I'll get to the main stuff. I'm putting this knowledge into a series of books giving the inner history of the fight for progress for the people of the United States. The second volume on the Lincoln era, 1830s to 1890s, will be published soon. Here is the cover. You saw it there. The third volume will take the story up through the assassinations of the 1960s, after which the transatlantic oligarchy took near absolute power. This presentation deals with how the USA might be seriously improved to serve its people, might be self-governing, and might help the world better, make the world better instead of promoting mass murder and chaos. I hope you will not tune out now because you idolize Trump or hate Trump. To do your part, you need to know the economic and strategic reality our country faces. Our country, USA, our country, Canada, and other countries. When I speak of our country, I'm speaking of the United States. The two sides in our history are the Americans who want to improve society and serve man in God's image versus the British Empire and its American partners. The former are nation builders favoring national sovereignty and cooperation. The latter are globalists favoring subjugation to authority and degradation of labor. Now, President Trump promises to rebuild our manufacturing. He and his team blame liberals and China for taking down our factories. He is referring to the establishment, but it's in general, it's liberals and Democrats. The deeper truth has to be faced, or Trump cannot succeed. We have to get to real economic development, and the people will have to be rallied to fight for their rights against the real enemy, oligarchism. I want to try to give some taste of the nature of this reality here on these two sides of the problem, the same problem, the economic development and the enemy, oligarchism. I want to start with just a little bit of history about New York City. How did New York City become wealthy and powerful? It was a port originally that was even in the slave trade under the Dutch and so forth, a natural port. So it was important, but it gained world status because the Erie Canal was built, which was a state enterprise, state of New York, and it was also the components for the Erie Canal connected the Hudson River to Lake Erie, across 300 miles of wilderness. That canal was built, and also other canals connecting Ohio to the Great Lakes in Ohio to the Ohio River. So the whole interior of the country was opened up. Those other canals were federal as well as state projects. So this is a national enterprise and a state enterprise. It was government doing it. What happened is that the manufacturing and especially farming from the interior blossomed because they had a way that was very cheap all of a sudden to get their products a far distant to a market. So this was market economics, but it was made to work by a government project. No private enterprise would do something on that scale. So the wealth that flowed into New York City for processing there or for export made New York a powerful center of world affairs. Now, on the other side, a transatlantic oligarchy grew up in New York City and in Boston. Those two oligarch centers worked together. This was the blue bloods of Boston and the merchants and bankers of New York City. They were in the slave trade. They went to the opium trade after the slaves rebelled in the Caribbean. And then they were in the brokering of cotton coming from the South. So these are people essentially based in criminal enterprises in association with the British Empire. Their partners were the Southern slave owners, particularly the leaders of Southern slave owners in Virginia and then other Southern states. These formed the two sides. That's the oligarch side. Our side were the people that promoted the canals, the building of the railroads, the building of factories as national projects, as the goal of the country to improve society. I'll get to something about who they were. So let's talk about some technology that America perfected and how that came about. talk about railroads. The first locomotives in America were built at the West Point Foundry, which was an auxiliary to the National School for the U.S. Army officers. They had a foundry and they built the first locomotives. Uh, they also trained the engineers at West Point under federal authority who designed America's first railroads. Uh, Congressman Henry Clay put through an act in 1824 authorizing the use of West Point engineers, military engineers, in civil works. And President John Quincy Adams then assigned them as engineers to design and build up the first railroads in America, Baltimore and Ohio, South Carolina. And then they went to Russia and built Russia's first serious railroad from Moscow to St. Petersburg. This is all in my first volume. So this is the beginning of railroads, of the American railroads. Britain already had some railroads and was developing at the same time, really. The Pennsylvania Railroad was a special case, and this became the greatest one and the perfecter of American railroads. This was a company that was developed as a municipal, a city and state government enterprise in conjunction with private investors, partnership. But who were the people doing this? Public and private, government and private. They were all part of a complex of nationalist idealists and builders and nation builders in that city of Philadelphia. That complex was started by Benjamin Franklin. He organized basically the whole thing back in the 1720s, 30s, and 40s. He founded the University of Pennsylvania, the American Philosophical Society. This became the center, that city, of the center of nationalist economics. The idea that the nation's government has to use its power to benefit, to interfere in commerce, to benefit the people of the country. But remember that what they're doing that for is to build up and improve and change society for the better, for the benefit of the people of the country. The Bank of the United States was there, the Franklin Institute, the Baldwin Locomotive Company, the Sellers Manufacturing Company of machine tools. This is all part of a complex. All of those people founded the Pennsylvania Railroad. How did they perfect railroads? I want you to think about this now for our current problem in the United States. American freight trains now carry freight at 25 miles an hour. China freight trains carry freight at from 60 to 100 miles per hour. Passengers, of course, much faster. So during the Civil War, there was we had trains on iron rails. And the nationalists in Philadelphia, the ones who were for high tariffs and for nation building, Pennsylvania Railroad people, they noted that the iron rails wore out fast. And so they organized a steel industry in the United States. We had no steel mills before that. When the Civil War was over, they set up the whole steel industry. They organized it. I have that story. That's chapter 7. They wanted to have U.S. producing these things, especially for steel rails to begin with, not imported from Great Britain. They also sponsored a guy named Westinghouse to put automatic air brakes on their trains. So that was the startup of that Westinghouse enterprise. But that made the trains be able to go fast because they wouldn't crash, because the air brakes would go on instantaneously. There was a fail-safe mechanism for the whole big train. You didn't have to screw down the car by car, the brake, and you had steel rails that wouldn't fail. Uh, this this was done in the political headquarters for both protective tariffs and greenbacks. That is the use of the federal government to print money, abundant supplies of money, which was directed by government policy and government credits policies into manufacturing and productive endeavors. So it wasn't inflationary. And over time, it made everything less expensive. These people were notably anti-imperialist. That's the American nationals. They opposed the empire. So they were in a death struggle with the empire. They were in favor of the development of Japan and China and Russia and Germany and aided all of those countries, China with less success, but the other ones with tremendous success to develop as powerful countries who would be our friends. That was the program of the American nation builders, to have government and private enterprise work together on a national strategy to develop the country. And there were specific projects to do that. It isn't all just gradual and investments flowed and so vague, some vague thing. It wasn't determined by markets. Then these same people in that Philadelphia headquarters sponsored the career of Thomas Edison and backed him against Wall Street's desires to have power plants in every city in the US and around the world. That was a big fight. Later, the electricity was expanded by Edison's foreign partners and by Franklin Roosevelt with the TVA and the rural electrification. Now let's look at this situation today of that we need modern facilities in our infrastructure, not choke points. Okay, we have world trade. President Trump is not proposing to shut down the trade. He wants to have China buy our goods and we stop buying so many of Chinese goods. But nevertheless, the trade is supposed to continue, right? Well, we don't have ports that are much good in a modern economy. The greatest port in the world right now is the port of Shanghai. It's called Yangshan. It's built on artificial islands about 20 miles offshore from Shanghai. There's a 21-mile bridge from the mainland. It's the busiest container port, the most modern. No United States port is in the top 50 of modern facilities. And I mentioned that railroads, the US average freight speed is 25 miles per hour. China is 3 to 4 times that. Our bridges and our tunnels are old, are from the 1960s or from early in the 20th century. We need a source of electricity that will be cheap, not just for consumers, but for industrial and agricultural and infrastructure purposes. To accomplish that in our, in the real world is going to take nuclear power plants. You may have opinions about those things. I'm sorry if you don't like that or you may disagree, but there's no competent alternative for the volume and character of this energy throughput. So probably modular nuclear power plants, maybe molten salt reactors that are the safest. China is building dozens and dozens of these power plants. We've stopped doing that. Germany renounced the right to do that. That was pretty bizarre. Fresh water. We need fresh water in large parts of our country, the west coast of Mississippi Valley. How will we get that fresh water there? Well, you have to have very large scale construction, idealistic, and it has to be focused on the needs of the people. All of this has to do with the needs of the people of the country. You have to start with that. If you're talking about health and good food and good nutrition, you need, above all, I would say, fast freight that's cheap in order to get fresh things to people. You need to be able to develop new forms of agriculture, new methods of growing food that are going to involve people that are not beholden to financiers. We used to have family farms. Education is the same thing. Don't start with simply an abstract discussion about philosophy. What are the needs of the people? What are the needs of families to participate in a modern economy? The space program. I'll just mention one aspect of this, which Trump and Elon Musk are not discussing that I've heard. Maybe they are. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And that is, if we are going to go to Mars, if we are going to get the riches of space, which are by definition limitless, we will have to be able to have a different propulsion than we have now. We don't have the technology in place to go to Mars with people. It's not practical. It takes a year to do it the way we do it now with chemical rockets. So you need to have acceleration, constant acceleration, then you decelerate the last third or so of the trip. That gives you artificial gravity, and it gets you there in 2 weeks instead of a year. That's also for interstellar flight, but forget that right now. We're talking about the practicality of getting around in the solar system. You have to have nuclear rockets or some other form of rockets. John Kennedy had already a nuclear rocket program. The test facility was out there, I think, in Nevada. All of that was canned. The whole Mars idea was canned, but it's not practical without acceleration. So if you hear people talking about space program without the new rockets that we need, without constant acceleration is the point that I'm trying to make here. So these are specific things. Do you get that with a tariff? Do you get ahead of China by blocking China? It seems to me that's sort of like you're playing a game of chess and you burn the board down instead of, improving your side. All right, now let's another aspect of this. In a modern, diverse economy, every human life is precious. We need more people, and we are losing valuable people who could participate in production and meeting people's needs. I can't stress this enough. It's not just the numbers of people, it's the quality of people and how we degrade them and destroy them and allow them to be degraded and destroyed. This is our worst, seriously, the worst aspect of our economy at the present time. Our birth rate is declining. We have 50,000 suicides a year. We have 100,000 drug overdose deaths. We have around 1 million abortions. We had 3 million births last year, which was down 2% from the year before. So we're losing and in danger of losing the capability of recovering. We need people. We need to value labor, which means valuing the human personality. the world fertility was 5 children per woman in 1950. It was 2.3 in 2021. It's still falling. Africa, look at Africa. A billion people there, and it's rising. They have a high fertility rate, so they're increasing their population. They need water, fresh water to be moved where it's needed. They have massive supplies, but it's not usually in the right place. They need tremendous supply of powerful electricity. And they need transport. And of course, any leader there knows that has to be transport that will develop the interior, not be taking things from a mine or a plantation to the port, to be exporting their riches, or from a sweatshop, same thing. China's Belt and Road program is acknowledged by Trump Circle, like Robert Lighthizer in his book, there is no free trade. No trade is free, it's called. He acknowledges that China is building the only infrastructure that's getting built in Africa. He says it's bad quality, they're doing it for bad reasons. Putting that aside, that judgment, we're not doing that. And there's no proposal from the West to participate in fulfilling the needs either of our own people in the West or in places like Africa. Again, if you propose high tariffs and blocking cheap imports and blocking the bringing in of cheap labor across the border, you're addressing certain things, but you don't really have a plan or a strategy for doing economic advancement based on reality. Does history have any bearing on this? Well, I don't know, because no one refers to the history of how we actually got our massive economy. That's why I'm writing this book. Let me talk about the other side, the opponents of the national agenda for industrialization and infrastructure from the beginning of the country until now. Not necessarily the same institutions, but it's the same faction. It's very continuous faction. From Jefferson and the leaders of Virginia and the South, they were part of this. They were opponents. They didn't want the country to be industrialized. And they spread slavery by robbing and abandoning the eastern soil. They had Northern Democrats and Boston Brahmin traders who were Federalists, who were together with them. This is the Northern financial crowd with the Southern plantation lords. So they were opponents of industrialization, opponents of Hamilton, and so forth. After the Civil War, you have J.P. Morgan coming in, and he's a linchpin. This is the Morgan firm, a banking firm originating in London and then brought over to New York, Philadelphia first, then New York. And so J.P. Morgan is the son of the British banker, Junius Morgan, and then he had another son, J.P. Morgan Jr. But that's a single bank. This is the enemy within the United States, opposed to U.S. Objectives and needs. So first of all, and they are adhering to the principle from 1782 by Lord Shelburne in the British government, the strategist for the East India Company, who said there will be no new industrial nations. We can't beat America by force, but we're going to have what we call free trade where they are not allowed to interfere in commerce. Their government can't interfere in commerce. We'll rule commerce and money, and therefore we will rule the world. We'll do it with cheap labor and we'll dominate them through trade. So that the idea of no new industrial nations. So J.P. Morgan, after the Civil War, well, first of all, he was on the against the U.S. in the Union side in the Civil War, so with real traitorous actions. I have that in my book. But after the war, Morgan opposed the building of the Northern Pacific Railroad. He brought that down, crashed the economy in 1873. Then he got into Edison's business and opposed Edison building any power plants that were not for the bankers in New York or London. Literally New York or London power plants. Edison broke from Morgan with the backing of these Philadelphia nationalists and built power plants around the country with the help of local people and with foreign help and with Philadelphia behind him. So then you have this Morgan gang in New York City formed a part of a fascist action team. And this is something that people need to pay pretty close attention to because, in my view, this continues to the present day. In those days, it was for the Hitler Project and for Mussolini and Tojo. And the action team was J.P. Morgan and his firm in New York, Montague Norman, the governor of the Bank of England. This is in the 1920s and 1930s, and certain other bankers in New York and London. But the two principal partners in this were Montague Norman and J.P. Morgan. They through Schacht and others, they sponsored Hitler's rise to power. They crippled Germany around 1930, 31, and brought in Hitler. Morgan had also started the American Legion with a $100,000 gift to them to be a veterans fascist movement right after World War I. They had the same veterans movements in France, Italy, and Germany. And so the Morgan firm was a headquarters for both a U.S. headquarters for Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo. There's a few other bankers involved, like George Bush's father, Prescott, but Morgan was the headquarters in the U.S. Now, I want to say that when you talk about the West, Nick used this term, the West, we in the West, imperialism is in no sense Western. It comes from the West, but it's not Western, and it doesn't believe in Western ideals or Western concepts. It's really a repeat of ancient Middle Eastern empires who worshipped devils, and monsters for gods. So, for example, there was a coup d'etat. These are generally CIA and MI6 joint operations. There's a coup d'etat in Guatemala, 1954, to make sure that there's only plantations and cheap labor and degradation in Guatemala. What about Western things like industry, like schools, like science? Oh no, we don't want that. We don't want the West meddling in our empire. India was like that all the time. They never let Christian missionaries go from England to India. The coup in Iran, 1954, kept it backward. They overthrew the democratic government. They stole the oil means to develop that country. FDR wanted that the oil to be controlled by Iran for their purposes. And of course, they developed this situation with Israel, where Israel would be a destroyer of the possibilities of modern powerful nations developing in the Middle East. The same thing happened, of course, with the wars and the sanctions, making people into savages and destroying native genius. People in Lebanon and Palestinians are very smart, just like Jews are very smart. The Israelis are crazy now, and these Lebanese and the Palestinians are under constant siege and mass murder. So there's a suppression of all of the intelligence and talent in the region through these wars. India and Pakistan, same thing. Obviously, brilliant people in the Indian subcontinent. The plan there has destroyed this. Ireland, North and South, Protestant versus Catholic, same thing. Korea versus Korea. Korea had a renaissance in the 1400s. They're brilliant. Japan versus China. Whereas our program for Japan in the 1870s was, we want to build you up so you can help build up the rest of Asia. Don't make war on China. That's what the US was pleading with them. Ukraine and all of Eastern Europe versus Russia. All the brilliance of European civilization in the East is destroyed by this contempt of this NATO crowd. Contempt for civilization. The Uyghurs or Tibet or Taiwan versus China. China, perhaps the most brilliant continuous nation in the world over thousands of years. Why destroy that? That's our hope for the future. Mankind's hope for the future is intelligence and morale. I'll close this with some examples of intelligence. The morale factor in excellence and excitement in accomplishments. Think about that. The morale factor in excellence and the excitement in accomplishments, which we would have to see in the projects sponsored by our country, which is not going to happen if you're leaving this to state governments or to private enterprise. You're going to see this excellence in private companies. But if the whole thing is left for the so-called market to determine, ruled by transatlantic maniacs, you won't see these things. So it starts off with Benjamin Franklin himself had cadres of people that were working with him and learning with him both in Philadelphia and in England. And this was at the root of our industrialization. There was excitement of people working with him. The founding of these institutions like the Lunar Society in England and the American Philosophical Society, the West Point as a government school for engineering. That was a point of engineering and high morale and excitement about building up our country, serving our country and serving other countries, building things in other countries. The whole group of these people in the Union cause, those in industry and in science and in the military, this is not the thing we have now, the military-industrial complex. This is the opposite in intention. These are nation builders. These are people who are earnest in trying to rescue civilization from the misleadership of empires. They understood empires. They opposed them. Baldwin Company in Philadelphia built locomotives. The workers were in a constant state of improvement. They had apprenticeship programs that made them the leading mechanics and skilled workers in the world. They could go to a foreign country and take parts of a complex locomotive off the ship and build a locomotive from the ground up. They were excited to do the same thing with Edison and his workers. people would work for almost nothing to get a job with Edison. I'm not saying he didn't pay them anything, but it was very exciting to do it. Morale factor. Same thing with William Palmer, who built up Colorado. In his regiment during the Civil War, he was a very moral man and fought against war crimes on the Union side. And then he built up Colorado with railroads, and everybody that worked with him was excited to do it. One of them married a lady that exposed the crimes of Americans against Native Americans, against Indians. So there was a certain kind of excitement and intelligence beyond the normal, stupid white person who doesn't see what's going on around him. These are centers of excitement, and because the excitement in accomplishment. That's the same thing with the top cadres of the New Deal for Franklin Roosevelt. Very, very excited to do these things. NASA is the obvious case in my lifetime. I guess that's after you guys, many of you. Hopefully, we're going to revive that. It can't just be left to private enterprise. We have to have national institutions that do this. Ethiopia, the Grand Renaissance Dam. I have a photograph of that as one of my pictures in volume 2. It was built now, not in the 19th century, but it has to do with the way Lincoln thought about man's difference from animals. I saw a documentary video on the Grand Renaissance Dam, the greatest electrification project in contemporary Africa. I saw a video showing the national pride of accomplishment in Ethiopia. This is done all by Ethiopians. They paid for it too. Ghana, the very smart country. Their leader, Kwame Nkrumah, was brilliant. He was the founder of African nationalism, a friend of John Kennedy. Kennedy brought him in. And Nkrumah was in the USA in the 1930s for 10 years. He saw what FDR was doing. He saw what the civil rights movement was doing in America to get the rights for Black people. And then he went over and overthrew British rule in Ghana. These are brilliant people, inspiring brilliance in the population. Vladimir Putin, whatever else you may think about him, is this type of person. He's a brilliant person. Yes, he's an autocrat. And we don't admire an autocracy. We think our Constitution is better than that. Well, let's try it out. Let's see if our Constitution might be a good thing to follow. It's like what Gandhi said about Christianity. It might be good. You should try it. And then these two other African leaders that I know of, Gamal Abdul Nasser, a brilliant man, a patriot, and a nation builder in Egypt, and Patrice Lumumba, who was murdered by, wanted to build up the Congo and rescue it from mass murder. And he was murdered 17 days before John Kennedy took office by MI6 and CIA, so that these hostile agencies could get away with it without interference by America, our government, our authorities. There's only one authority in America, that's constitutional government. These other people are usurpers. They have no authority. Trump is taking down certain agencies. He's also savagely cutting down the federal workforce, which is, as far as I can see, is being done stupidly. But as far as these agencies are concerned, what is their authority? Who runs them? Who runs the government? You see commentaries about how the British government is our model for the rule of law. You used to have a king that was absolute, but then you got a monarchy that was a constitutional monarch and it had to submit to the will of Parliament. Bloody, bloody, bloody. Is that really true? When was that true? There are interests in the empire, particularly, that are international and control the parliament in conjunction with aristocracy like the monarchy. That's the reality. These are the people that have stopped our economy and have brought it down and have run the United States into being a menace to its own people and to the rest of the world. So if you're going to change that, you have to confront this reality, not some vague story about that you have heard about how tariffs made us into a powerful country. It's a very small part of the story. So I'll leave it there. Open it up for questions.
Anton,
Oh,
thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and yeah, it's just you're so specific. I love the specificity that you get into about these things. Let's open it up to questions. Bruce, I just want to say your centers of excitement, your inspired moment there, I really liked that. We should have centers for excitement, especially for the disenfranchised youth that we have today.
that's right.
Let
Well,
me,
I was repeating, oh, go ahead.
no, after you, please.
I was repeating, Anton had just said it. And that's what I feel when I read and listen to my friend Anton Chaitkin. And Anton, here's an observation and a question. You and your work make me feel very young again. I was in grammar school in the 1960s, and they still celebrated American history. Back then, they still had above the chalkboard in front of you the portrait of Washington and the portrait of Lincoln, and then the American flag was at one of the top corners. And all this perspective, the two competing Americas, it's such a great organizing principle. It's such an unknown history that I know excites everyone who loves your work and excites you. Obviously, I think every single American, young and old, ought to know this distinction, to see that the revolution isn't over. Every generation has to fight the revolution against the oligarchical forces and the forces of empire for the sake of a concept of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. If you had to narrow it down to one, two, or three most influential groups or professions, Anton, in the United States, who would you want to ignite with this kind of overview?
Uh, well, I would say that you have some people that are disposed to think this way. That is, they're what they do or the way that they think already is leaning in this direction. That's educators, that's scientists, that's military men who are not in these insane utopians and spoon benders. That's diplomats who again are not neocons or these monstrous neoliberals. One of the worst person in international affairs that I have ever seen was Jake Sullivan. So not Jake Sullivan, but other people that are involved in international affairs. But the problem is, of course, Trump supporters. And liberal Democrats. Liberal Democrats, when I was growing up, were in favor of civil liberties. They were in favor of higher living standards, not um, not cutting down on living standards, human living standards, in order to benefit categories of fish, or making up one story after another about why it's not good to improve things. They also were often knowledgeable about history and tried to apply it. So those were liberals. Then the Trump people had, and there are many liberals who would like to get back to that now. I know about that. I know some of them. And then there's Trump people who voted to revive American manufacturing and the American family. If they could just concentrate on what they need to do positively, that is, how can a family succeed? They need industrial jobs. It has to be modern or it won't succeed. But that's modern industry, not warfare. AI is warfare. That's the primary use of it. So physical infrastructure, physical communities, the wealth that's generated by physical production and infrastructure and energy and the resources, new resources, all these things. Generating that wealth is gonna let you have a successful family, and let you have the wealth that you need, that will encourage people to have larger families and to be able to survive and take care of their families and the old people like me and young people. So that's that. So parents and Trump supporters and liberals would be one category, but the other people, all of those that I mentioned, are already halfway there.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to take Eliza first. John, I'll get to you after, and also the people in the chat. Just I saw Eliza's hand go up very early. So, Eliza.
Hi. Um,
Hi.
it 2 hours from now, I have a chance to have I'm in Canada, so the local candidates are having a conservative party sort of pub night sort of thing. And how can someone like me be effective at talking to candidates? I can't load too much on them all at once, but they just don't appear to know all that much when I ask them questions.
Okay, I would start with you thinking through how you and others might relate to the needs of the people that are not being met right now. What do the people need? In America, in Ohio, for example, where they're committing suicide and taking dope, this is called the Rust Belt. They lost their jobs in these factories. That was the center of world industry. I am sure there's something like that in Canada as well. There are also Native Americans and also impoverished centers for Black people, some white people in various parts of our country. But take the Native Americans, and you have this widespread problem in Canada as well. What do they need? Don't assume, like some white professor in London has taught us, that the Native Americans want to hunt buffaloes. And the great crime would be to deprive them of the opportunity to shoot arrows at buffaloes. That's a pretty ignorant view of several thousands of years of the peoples of the Americas. That's not all they did. And so right now, what do they need? Well, they are due justice. And that justice means they need to have a helping hand, which was robbed from them, to participate in modern society. And that's what they want. That's what they're asking for. They got casinos, which allowed for a certain money wealth, but overall, they have the same problem in general that the rest of us have. And that is, there needs to be farming and industry. In their case, they have certain specific needs of production and a productive role in our society. It doesn't, I'm not talking about religion. I'm not talking about native customs. I'm not talking about culture, because you can't really preserve any of that if you're consigned to alcoholism, to poverty, to forced destruction of your family. That's what's been imposed on these people by our society. They are due justice, like the rest of us are due justice. So you've got to have industry and agriculture with a specific helping hand to the impoverished. We all got that helping hand. Look at and this, I've got this in my book about the Reconstruction period. What happened to the Black people who were freed from slavery? Well, the nationalists like Thaddeus Stevens, a congressman from Pennsylvania, wanted to change the South. Very important. Understand this. They used to have plantations where people were slaves. So now they're free from official slavery, but the old white masters own plantations still, and they want these Black slaves to come back and work for them cheap and be virtual slaves again. And so the nationalists said, no, we don't want plantations at all. We want to have a modern economy. We want to bring immigrants in here that who are skilled. We want to have schools. There weren't any public schools for anybody in the South before the war. We want to have iron production, steel production. We want to have cities built. We want to use the resources of the South to build up modern times in the South, so that the workers of the South, white and Black, are more valuable because they're skilled. When they're more valuable, they're producing more and they get higher wages. You can't run a modern facility with low-wage labor. I'm sorry, it doesn't work. So the nationalists said, let's change the South. Let's industrialize it, and let's have family farms, not plantations, which in the West would mean not just, big, huge landowners with cattle or mine owners. Let's have enterprises that build up civilization on that basis. What happened? The liberals in Boston said, no, we want cheap labor. We want free trade. We want cotton to come from the South to our cotton mills in Boston. And so we used to be abolitionists before the Civil War. Now we've ended slavery. But we want the white people of the South to decide and to be the masters again. These were the liberals from before the war. The nationalists would be called conservatives now, but they were the ones who fought for Black rights. So it's the same thing with the Native Americans today. A person who cares about the human beings is going to fight for industrial progress and scientific agriculture. If you believe that there are 5 or 6 or 7 seasons in the year in the weather. You may be entitled to that belief, but you're wrong and your farm won't succeed. There is such a thing as scientific truth. I don't just leave it to some authorities who claim they're authorities, but there is such a thing as scientific progress, and that involves mastery over nature. Environmentalists in Canada and in Portland and in Seattle generally have had the position of acting to destroy poor people, absolutely destroy them with their concepts of leaving nature to its own devices. So you have a choice there in Canada. Let's get back to the progress that some people like Kennedy, like FDR, like some of your Canadian leaders in the past, they had nuclear power plants. They had water projects. They had all kinds of projects that were very good. They're very skilled engineers. They had the space program, a tremendous Canadian participation in the space program. That is what you have to fight for. That's what Canada can do for the world, as well as its own people of all kinds. And so this positive idea of progress, that's what I'm trying to get across. Is that easy to get across? Are you going to run into prejudice and even hatred? Maybe, but you're not doing it on a partisan basis. Do you know enough about all this to be able to tell people about it? You do. You don't have to know everything about it. You know what I'm talking about. So just that's what you have to do, in my view.
In British Columbia, the Aboriginal people actually own the rights to some of the pipelines, and they own the Kitimat natural gas station as well too. And the Aboriginal people that I've come to know, they really want development because they see it as a way of getting out from the coercion of Ottawa and the federal government in Canada, because they don't want to be asking for in fact, they see the government giving them handouts as a kind of slavery.
Yeah, but they're not going to get out of that slavery by simply stopping government handouts. There has to be a strategy for development of the country. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
I'll take John. John's ready.
So the interesting thing to me is that all of the industrialization depends on capitalizing people's capacities. And I was interested that you didn't mention the debt-based monetary system and that the people who are in charge of the deep state, et cetera, are all international bankers. So the solution to the problem that you're describing is issue the money so that people have what they need in order to be able to realize their capacity to do something that serves their community. Because everybody wants to serve a transcendent purpose with the resources that they need in order to do it really well.
Yeah.
I yield.
So chapter 4 of my forthcoming book, and I could send it to anybody that wants to see it right away. And that is, it's called Lincoln versus the Money Power. And it's about greenbacks in particular. But it talks about really the two sides on what you're talking about. It wasn't just money. And of course, Lincoln and his allies favored this transcendent purpose of mankind. That's the difference.
Right.
It's not just about money.
Right, it isn't.
Right. So that's the fight. Yes, absolutely. I agree.
So I just want to tell one little story so that people will be motivated to pursue this. Lincoln's quest was for the government to be concerned about the infrastructure that the people need in order to enjoy rising standards of living. That's where that phrase actually comes from. And his proposal for a national banking system was to counter the fact that the banking cartel, which there wasn't a Federal Reserve yet, there wasn't a central bank in America. Andrew Jackson had basically said, we're never going back there. But Lincoln wanted to establish a national banking system, a government-run national banking system that would always be able to assure that the amount of money available would represent the capacity of the people to be productive. And he's very clear about saying that. And so I want your eighth chapter or whichever one it was, and I want everybody to know this about Lincoln. When you think about the Civil War, we think that Lincoln was anti-slavery and he was all for eliminating slavery. It's not true. He was opposed to the plot of the European bankers to divide America into two warring factions over which they could rule more easily. And their solution after they kill Lincoln, their solution was to make sure that everybody in the banking industry across America understood that debt and wage slavery is more profitable than chattel slavery. Anyway,
Well,
I yield.
yeah, I disagree about Lincoln's view of slavery. I mean, he was definitely, he when he was a child, he was born in Kentucky, and which was a slave state, and his father was a poor farmer and laborer, and all the laws of the state about property and other things were for the benefit of the powerful slave owners, and workers and farmers were crushed under these laws. Lincoln saw both the evils of slavery, how slaves were treated inhumanly, and how slavery was a crime against the whole community. He saw that from his birth. They moved out of Kentucky for that reason, for a combination of things, all of it relating to slavery. So it's true that he had an overriding economic idea about improving the whole country. Within that, the idea about slavery was that the system of black chattel slavery would be overwhelmed and taken down by industrializing the United States, including the South, and integrating the South with the North. He didn't look away from slavery. He was totally opposed to it. He did,
Right.
but as you say, he did not want to. He didn't want to allow the country to be divided. The abolition. I go into this in depth in the book.
Okay, very good.
The abolitionists of the Garrison's type wanted to so-called deal with slavery by having the North and South separate, and so the North would be the United States, and the South would have the slaves, so that there wouldn't be any slavery in the United States. That's what it amounted to. So Lincoln wanted to have slavery abolished, but just like Frederick Douglass, it had to be abolished within the Union. I really don't want to get into an argument about Lincoln. I think there's
No,
lots
no,
of
no, no, no. I totally agree with you. I was not meaning for a second
okay,
that Lincoln was in favor of slavery somehow.
yeah,
Not at all. What I was trying to get at was that the way that Lincoln is represented is too one-sided. He was
that's true.
fighting to preserve the Union from the bankers in Europe.
That's true. No, you're right. That's true. And
That's
they did.
all I wanted to say.
I talk about some of their direct representatives in New York and Boston in this book. So anyway, Good. That's really good.
Thank you, John. John, you may consider writing an article yourself. You sound pretty well versed on it. Um, who do we have next? Yeah, I see. Wonderful question. Peter has his hand raised.
Thank you, Nick, and good afternoon to you again, Anton.
Hi.
I have a specific question on the development of water projects. What alternatives for freshwater development exist as you see it, in contrast to mere piping of fresh water from the Great Lakes to the more arid places within the United States? This caused quite a controversy when I lived up in Duluth.
So a simple answer really is that if you look back at our greatest developments, the first railroads as a national project, the steel industry as a national project, as I go through here, the Transcontinental Railroad and the other transcontinental railroads that were built after that. I'm sorry, I'm going to turn this off. So these are great projects. These are massive changes that took place in our country. And so the question is, are you serious about something that's very, very hard to do? It's been done. Very, very hard things have been done. That's the real history of all the greatest accomplishments of mankind. So in the present reality, both in America and in other parts of the world, there are water shortages. How big are you willing to think? Are you willing to think big enough and look into history enough and look into the real views of civil engineers enough to actually solve the problem or not? You might, and one of the obvious problems that you know, Peter, is the conservative, I'm putting this in quotes, the conservative view that the marketplace will determine how things will be built, how problems will be tackled. Well, how were they tackled in the past? Did the marketplace itself decide what was done? Never, never. How do we get power plants? Edison and his backers fought for them. The US government at certain times fought for it. They had to fight private interests. Edison was a businessman. He was a private interest also. This is not even talking about private enterprise versus socialism here. That's not the issue. The issue is, do you intend to solve a physical problem, an economic problem? Physical can also be spiritual, right? It has to do with culture. But so the volume of water that is needed within the continental United States may be larger than the resources available anywhere near where the water is needed, where you need to bring the water. So obviously the world, if you look at the Earth from space, it's blue. It's water. It's a water planet. You can't be that stupid that you couldn't come up with very big, if necessary, plans to move water from Canada and Alaska, or from the northwest of the United States, or from wherever else you're going to get it, in volumes necessary, including desalinating water. That was a big project of John Kennedy. That probably involves nuclear power for cheap electricity to do the job. But it's not this is not primarily a technical issue. It involves tremendous technical challenges, but the obvious, issue involved is the question of self-government. Do people have enough confidence to demand solution to their problems? To be able to first see what their problems are. There is a water shortage in parts of our country, in California and other places. Why not solve the problem? Well, it would cost too much. Where's the money going to come from? Well, has that question ever been asked before about a big problem? Obviously, it has. How was it solved in the past? I'm not going to go through a history of all the financing, but it has been solved in the past. Did our country go bankrupt when we solved big problems and spent massive amounts of money to solve them? No, it made us rich. Is that a paradox? That's your problem. That's the problem in your education if that's too heavy for you. But that's the issue, right? This is, the Congress and the civil engineers know solutions for these problems. They're smart people. The Congress isn't smart people now because they're owned by people who hate human beings. But these problems have been addressed and they're published. The issue is think big.
Yeah, think big and let the numbers catch up. Who's next? Chris. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Anton. I'm from Ohio. I grew up. My father grew up in Cleveland. I grew up in Columbus, but I do have a question on how we get there from here. I was thinking,
That's a good one.
it is like I was thinking, we just need to grow up and face realities. We need to start facing reality is the first thing, maybe, but we need to have an informed, participatory democracy. We need to have citizens who are informed, but we're morally, culturally, economically bankrupt, and we've got a president who's an expert in bankruptcy. Maybe that's a good thing. It's hard to know how to look at things. I don't want to black pill this discussion, but just thinking about Cleveland. Cleveland is a city. It was one of the greatest cities in America, in the world. It was the city of lights, amazing history, and overnight it went from being that a great city to being a joke, the mistake by the lake.
Exactly.
And it always bugged me, not only because I'm a Cleveland Browns fan, but what would the world have looked like if that hadn't been Cleveland's fate? Because it seemed deliberate. If you go to Cleveland, if you visit it even now, you could see, God, this is a beautiful city. Like there's still incredible possibilities. There's hydropower everywhere. There's water everywhere. There's waterfalls everywhere. There's still trains coming in. It's the ideal place. It just needs the will. But what happened? I mean, was it the Rockefellers that just pulled out? It almost seems to me like they got so scared of the Cleveland, this melting pot of the people were going to be too successful and powerful in that kind of in that space, and they had to bring it down, and so went the rest of the country. Is that coming up in your third book? I don't know.
Yes. Yes.
It is. Okay.
So,
All right,
this is wonderful. And I love Cleveland. I love this story. Cleveland and America had decisive influence in the modern world. The success of that aspect of our society energized the whole human race. Now, let's specify how Cleveland started. Now, you might find some story about some white guy that went to there into Indian territory and set up an outpost somewhere. That's not how it started. The Erie Canal started Cleveland. The Erie Canal of New York State and the Erie Canals of Ohio that went down from the Lake Erie down to the Ohio River. So Cleveland was founded as one of the places that was strategically located to benefit from the manufacturing and farming resources, including this transport. That they had an instant market for themselves far away. And so people could come there and develop something new and powerful and great. All right, so that's the origin of the city. And that's basically the idea of it. It has to do with the place of these people in national and world affairs. Right? And they have a proud place at different times, so the founding and later on. Now, who knows about that? Well, I do for one. So if you ask, how are we going to go from here to there? One suggestion and plea that I have for you is to support what I do. Help me to do what I do. I am 81. I'm going to be 82 soon. I take care of my wife, who had a stroke, but she's recovered, and we're partners. We've been married almost 59 years. And so we have a lot of responsibilities here in our household. I don't have the money or the resources. Thank God there is the internet now. I can be at home and access massive archives, which I used to do by living in libraries like the Library of Congress. But right now, with great difficulty, I'm using 50 years of research to develop these stories and this particular knowledge about the history of what we're talking about. In some sense, that's unique. So, among other things, help me do what I have to do. I don't know any other way to say this. I've started work on volume 3 of this theory. This is a unique series of books. It's based on, I did a lot of articles on this basis, but the idea of the accomplishments of our civilization since the Industrial Revolution, or beginning with the Industrial Revolution, that doesn't negate what happened before that, but there are accomplishments of our civilization in the modern world. I'm not dealing with all of them. I'm dealing with a particular fight within the USA, which was decisive on the whole world. But this is unique, what I'm dealing with. And so I was trying to give people a taste of that, as partly as an advertisement to get help from people. I need publicity for these books. I need people to buy them. I also need to spread this fight about the needs of the people based in futurity. Right? What are the needs of the Americans? And how does that fit into the needs of the rest of the planet? When you start considering things in that way, all of our best leaders considered foreign needs as well as Americans, even though they were nationalists. They were committed to the welfare of the people, which is the only constitutional government you can have. They have to start with our people's needs. That's why you have tariffs. That's why you have national enterprises. It's not communism. It's the American system. But they looked out for the people. And those are the only people that did any good. They were not a majority of leaders. Only a few of our presidents were any good, in my view. But we did have a consensus behind what the best of them did. That is, of national progress, which was broken in the period of the 1970s, 1980s, and beyond that. So we need that consensus back again. But in order to do that, you have to have a trenchant criticism of the just ridiculous history on both sides. You know, if you're talking about NATO or any of these political strategic things, what's the history of that? People say, well, it started with Franklin Roosevelt and the alliance with England. That's just not true. We had an alliance with England to stop Hitler, and England in many ways started Hitler. The real problem comes up with this gang, which is involved with NATO, that are killers, that hate civilization. They have no concept of it. And I have some articles written. I'll get into that in the third volume. But how are you going to deal with these problems? People in the Trump circle don't deal with it at all. China is our enemy. When did that history start? If you think about that. Oh gosh. Well, we know that history started with either the Biden administration or maybe Reagan administration or who knows what. And maybe we can talk about some people that we want to talk about from the 19th century or George Washington. From time to time, we'll talk about them, but they have nothing to do with what we're doing now. China is our enemy. Well, what's the history of that? Does that have a history? So there's so much deliberate falsification going on. Well-intentioned by people who want to revive American manufacturing, who seriously want to do that. I believe that there is something that accords with the will of the voters. But I've got a special project that I want to involve you with, which is to develop these books. I need research help as well. I need people that can collaborate with me.
Yeah, I'm very happy.
I'm not going to be around long enough to see what happens, in the next century. But and who knows how long I will be around. But so help me do what I'm doing. That's my answer.
Yeah, Anton, I'm so glad we got to this place. I was just literally 10 minutes ago, it popped up in my brain, that thing of like, how could we expose Anton Chaitkin even more to the world? And I was thinking, especially in Africa, I want to take 100 of your books out there and give them to teenagers in their 16, 18, 22-year-old period. Because,
Especially book readers.
yeah, I want to get libraries started and things like this that are accessible for public out there in the townships so that, and we can do this in the West as well. We can set up book reading and we can do youth clubs and we can do all sorts of things with younger people, especially that thing of political action and inspiring them. The thing is with the youth today, we have a lot of youth that have given up on politics because all they ever are witnessing is a corrupt system that doesn't serve them. And so they just get disenfranchised or, lose inspiration with it. And actually, these books can teach them that politics is a force for nation building and is a force for progress and can actually, if you have the right mental instruments, if you could get into a powerful chair, you could institute change. But you need to know Hamiltonian economics. You do
I'd
need
like to have a
know,
dialogue I would like to have personally a dialogue with some intelligent people in Africa
yeah.
and discuss some of the American history that's relevant to them. I'm not an expert on Africa, but I know what happened with America's relationship there.
Yeah, and
And so crucial.
a lot of these points are universal anyway.
Yes, that's right. They are universal. Yeah.
And we saw with what Kennedy was doing by giving those Pan-African leaders a platform.
Yes.
He
Well, he
exposed them
was
to
a
the world.
senator
He
as well
showed
as
the world what was happening. Otherwise, nobody would have known in the 60s what was happening in Africa if Kennedy hadn't. Like Kwame Nkrumah is the first leader he invites to the White House. So that's a clear
yeah.
intention. And when you have clear intentions like that, you can really open up the box very quickly. And so I do look forward to getting down to Washington to see you and talking more about how
Good.
we can organize. Richard, please take the
Yeah,
floor.
thank you, Anton. I just have a comment that's relevant to Putin and Trump, and that is that I think it's easy to confuse leadership with autocracy. And I think if leadership occurs within the constitutional legal system and it's doing things that people want, then that's leadership, not autocracy, sort of like the Philadelphia group. And I think one of the reasons it's easy for us in the West to make that confusion is we're so used to not having any leadership. You know, things kind of mumble along from one term, and then 4 years later they mumble the other direction. And so when we actually see leadership happening, we suddenly think autocracy, dictatorship, because we're so unused to it. Now, in Trump's case, there are some questions about the constitutionality. I mean, he has this unitary executive theory, which may or may not end up being substantiated by the Supreme Court, but there is that question. But he is doing what he said he was going to do, and there's a whole lot of acceptance of it. I will say one last little on a different subject. Instead of saying mastering nature, I would talk about cooperating with nature.
Okay.
Different subject. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, we're not God, right? So we want to cooperate with nature. In South America, the most advanced cultures and long ago learned to use the forces of nature to irrigate and to carry water long distances, to change the character of crops. They created new forms of food. They created corn. They created other things that didn't exist before. So they're cooperating with nature. They're learning to see well. They're learning nature's secrets and using those to improve the status of man. So one of the funniest things about the discussion of Trump's unitary executive issue is when people talk about the rule of law being the system that the West has followed in recent decades, and really they like to contrast this with earlier generations that had slavery or that discriminated against other people, women or what have you. So in the recent decades, we're better than we were because now we talk about everybody's rights. And so we're trying to follow the rule of law, and we criticize the people in other countries that are autocrats or that violate people's rights. Well, what is oligarchy? How does oligarchy, that is the rule from not public rule, but private rule, the rule of private interests and people acting in private, not in a public view. This was brought up at the time of the Constitutional Convention by James Wilson in particular, who invented the presidency in some ways at the convention. And he said that the problem of the British monarchy was the old Venetian system that was in operation there. And that was that the king had counselors, advisors, and powerful men around him that determined what was going to happen. And the public knew nothing about this. What happened was not the result of people named in some constitution, some offices, like Secretary of State or something, which are named in law. These are private people who have control over decision-making in the government. They're not in the government themselves, or they might be. It doesn't matter because it's a gang. And so this cloudy Venetian system is the problem that James Wilson was talking about, and that's the problem today. If you talk about the deep state, sometimes people think they mean that that's a permanent bureaucracy that's in the government. That is the problem. But they're not acting for themselves. They are acting in conjunction with and under the direction often of a gang, specifically transatlantic gang. What's Trump's relationship to that gang? I'm not sure. He's a billionaire, so in some sense, he had to conform with the gang's wishes. To become a billionaire, you have to do something that is egotistic. And their egotism often is mass murderous. So I don't know what his relationship to the oligarchy is. I think that the more important question is, what do the people who are demanding progress see as the way to get that progress? What are they supposed to do? What does Trump have to do? I don't care if he wants to do it or doesn't want to do it. That's not what I don't know enough about Trump. And I don't think other people do either. I think they're talking through their hats about what his character is. I don't put my faith and trust in any leader. Period. How would you give up your independent thinking as a person who studies what's going on? So the issue is, what is the relationship of that oligarchy to our country's policies? That oligarchy are mass murderers. They killed our president, Kennedy, and his brother, and Martin Luther King. Trump already treats those three murders as basically a single phenomenon. I think that's accurate. They are the ones who developed this concept of using berserker interference in different regions of the world, like Israel is doing, as a way of keeping a meta stability, meaning their rule. So that's not a conspiracy theory. This is going on for thousands of years. You don't need to get deeply mired in looking into Freemasonry or some other part of oligarchy to figure this out. The question is, how do we resume progress? And that involves getting that oligarchy out of power by getting the progress starting, and you're going to have a fight with them. But you have to recognize the reality of how the economy will really be developed. What's the history of that? And who is the real enemy? Those are all connected to each other.
Hey, Sam, I believe you were next. Sam? Yes.
Yes, I'm here. Sorry. I
I
just
know.
was muted while I was talking. Just as a quick comment, I recently found, Tony, a very interesting paper on Permindex from a EIR special report. It was by Jeff Steinberg and David Goldman, I believe, from 1981. It was the best thing I've ever found on Permindex by far. And it talked about Trump and his relationship to Roy Cohn and the real estate developers in New York and their involvement in laundering the drug money. That was one of their purposes. So I think he's been tied to this. I don't know, you know, we know he was tied to Jeffrey Epstein too in the past, but he seems to have broken with him. I think definitely Trump knows how these people operate, whether he's broken with them or what his relationship to them is today is not clear. But I just wanted to throw that out as a comment because something I was reading just as early as yesterday. I had a question about Hamilton and Franklin. Um, what what have you found linking Hamilton and Franklin? I haven't found much like in terms of them cooperating together, um, communicating, correspondence, anything like that. One thing I have found is Tench Cox, who was his deputy secretary of the Treasury under Washington. And
Yeah.
Tench Cox was from Philadelphia and was a protege of Ben Franklin. Um, and I recently got a book called The Other Federalist Papers about Tench Cox, and they argue that his quote unquote Federalist Papers defending the Constitution were more influential at the time than Hamilton's because Hamilton's were addressed only to the state of New York and were only locally published there at the time, whereas Tench Cox's were published in the Philadelphia Gazette or Pennsylvania Gazette, I can't remember which one, and were published nationally and were addressed to the citizens of the United States. It's an interesting book. I've just started it. And the other thing that I found that unites them is their love of Vattel, who wrote the Law of Nations, which was very explicit Leibnizian influence. And I know both Franklin and Hamilton, like Forrest McDonald wrote a biography of Hamilton where she goes over Vattel's influence on Hamilton and how he reshaped his thinking. We know Ben Franklin and the founding fathers consulted with Vattel during the constitutional conventions very heavily, and that for the first 100 years or so of the Republic, he was the most cited legal authority in legal cases. Anyway, so just if you could talk about anything else you found linking Franklin and
Okay,
Hamilton, I'm very
that's a good
interested in the
question.
topic. And any help I could give you in research, I'll send you an email after this.
Good.
I would be more than happy
That's
to
great.
help any way I can.
Thank you, Sam. I would say one way of looking at how they go together is when they literally did go together, which is in the period of the American Revolution. After later in the Revolution, in the early 1780s, Franklin came back to the U.S. after the war started, the Revolutionary War started. He had been in England for 18 years, trying to develop England to be a better place. And so he had to come back here, 1775, and he became a leader here, but then he had to go to France, right? So then he comes back to Philadelphia in the 1780s, after the Revolution. He becomes the president of Pennsylvania, like the governor, and otherwise was the recognized leader of that state and of Philadelphia. An old man, very old. And this is a period in which Hamilton is playing a central role in developing the ideas of nationality. So the two leaders coincide in this period of the 1780s, and specifically do so in Philadelphia. Hamilton was from New York, but the base for Hamilton's point of view was really Philadelphia. was Franklin's Philadelphia. People like Robert Morris and others, James Wilson. These are Hamiltonians, and they are apostles of Franklin. So the idea of nationality is being passed to a new generation. Hamilton is a leader of that, along with George Washington. So you have George Washington, Hamilton, and Franklin are the three great leaders who were in Philadelphia in the 1780s to define the course for the new nation that declared independence. There was a very important meeting. There's actually a series of meetings, but the first one, meeting at Franklin's home in Philadelphia. And this was during the convening of the Constitutional Convention. Tench Coxe gave his presentation there about the need for protective tariffs and nationalist economics. And that was published as a pamphlet for the benefit of the Constitutional Convention people. This is Hamiltonian economics at that time. And of course, Tench Coxe later became Hamilton's deputy secretary or assistant secretary, whatever it was, of the Treasury. But he's helping both of these leaders, specifically Franklin, who was the economic and technological genius, among other things, in founding the country, and Hamilton, who takes the torch from Franklin. How did they work together? In the Revolution. That was their project. George Washington, Franklin, and then later Hamilton. Washington and Franklin are the two great leaders of the American Revolution, along with some great leaders in Boston. But the nationalist headquarters is in Philadelphia. That's where Hamilton had his headquarters for the period of the development of the new country. It was the national capital during the 1790s. Hamilton had his Bank of the United States there. Franklin was the governor of that place. And then he died in 1790. So the two of them meet and coincide. It's not a matter of parties. Franklin was very favorable to Jefferson when Jefferson did any good. Jefferson was a revolutionary. He was opposed to slavery, even though he was a slave owner. Then he changed and took the side of Southern interests, so-called. And I go through that whole thing in the book, first volume. But that the important thing is the American Revolution as a nationalist enterprise, not in a narrow sense, but on behalf of all mankind. They both are thinking of all mankind. They're thinking of human beings in the light of eternity. That's how they join up together. They're both activists and philosophers at the same time.
I really liked in volume one your part about Jefferson when they brought in the Erie Canal. He said, "Oh, we could probably build it in 100 years," and it was finished like 9 years later.
I know that DeWitt Clinton was a nationalist. He wanted the nation to do this, and he goes to the president, and Jefferson says what you said. It's 100 years before its time. But eventually, it was finished as a nationalist, as a nation-building enterprise by John Quincy Adams and others in the 1820s when they built the other canals into Ohio. But I agree, that's a high point of this debate.
Thank you, Tony. I'm currently writing a series of articles. The one I'm working on now is about William McKinley, the anti-imperialist. I find his name is being dragged through the mud because Trump has expressed such admiration for McKinley. And I've seen a number of people calling him a fanatical imperialist, and I'm trying to correct the record on that. I'll be happy to send that to you once it's finished.
Okay. I make sure that you, I don't know, be realistic about it. He had a weakness, which wasn't his fault. It was that the national leadership had seriously decayed. The Republican Party was controlled by oligarchs and financiers in large part, not completely. He was bucking the Republican Party. That sounds familiar, right?
Yeah.
But he gave in. He didn't have any choice, supposedly. He gave in to the war against Spain to conquer Cuba and Philippines and Puerto
He did
Rico.
eventually give in, yeah, and the public pressure, the public
Yeah,
was driven to this war frenzy by Hearst, and
yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt was largely responsible for that as well. But he and Hanna, for a long time, were doing everything they could to
I
avoid
know,
war
I know
with
that,
Spain.
I
Yeah,
know that. What I'm making a larger point that there's a period of America's real heyday in that era, which is from the 1860, the election of Lincoln, until about 1789. So it's about 20 years. In that period, the US developed an intense following in the world and among its own people. There was a supermajority of people that would have followed any new Lincoln. And so that leadership, Henry Carey died, Lincoln was murdered, Garfield was murdered. He's not a new Lincoln, but he was a good man. McKinley was murdered. He wasn't a new Lincoln, but he was a very good man. Both Garfield and McKinley were anti-slavery and pro-black rights.
yeah. I would say McKinley's the closest we got to a new Lincoln. He was very pro-peace. He was pro-economic development. He was for high tariffs and infrastructure building. And from the first to the last, his first speech to his last speech, he talked about the importance of peace.
But let me bring this up again. I mean, I don't know if we have time, but just quickly, who at that time in the late 1800s, who at that time was telling the truth about the power structure? I don't think McKinley did. I'm not blaming him. I'm not singling him out. I think he was a great man. I love McKinley. But you have to have some socialist or some populist or somebody who doesn't have the breadth of knowledge to bring the country forward, but is naming Rockefeller, is naming Vanderbilt, is naming Morgan, is naming the Bank of England, is naming the combination of these people with Southern plantation owners, is naming the leaders of trusts. What is this? And this goes to Trump's background. What kind of business is making money by essentially bringing people down to a lower status and making people poor? What do you call that? It's called crime. Right? It's crime. The British Empire and the people who worked with them were part of a vast criminal enterprise. So if Trump is a slumlord, I don't know what he was. Let's say he was a slumlord in New York. So he was a criminal. Call a spade a spade. You don't have to deal with Roy Cohn. You don't have to deal with a lot of other things. This is one aspect of our country, is that we have this side of our country, which is crime. And there's an economic aspect to this. So let's assume that Trump was a criminal. Did you ever hear about a criminal, especially one that went to prison, he didn't go to prison, but think about a criminal who goes to prison and then comes out of prison and perhaps, for some reason or other, changes his course. That's possible, isn't it? I know that the forebears of Franklin Roosevelt, especially his grandfather on his mother's side, were part of a vast and mass murderous criminal enterprise. His mother's father was in the Russell Syndicate for the opium, and that wasn't just selling opium, they did it with the British, crushing China, and made all their money by this opium racket. And it was criminal, and they knew it was criminal and said so themselves. Roosevelt grew up with this point of view. Not that he was interested in opium or cared about that, but he is surrounded by all kinds of oligarchs and people, not just rich people, but people, not his father. His father was an honorable man, but people who made their money from crime. Some of them were not like that. It was one of the Aspinwalls was working for Lincoln over in England, intelligence against some other Roosevelt relatives. But Roosevelt changed his mind in the 1920s. Seriously changed his mind and took the side of people who were suffering. I don't think it's all related to having polio either. So that's another discussion. I think we're going to have to wrap this up pretty quick.
Let's just have one final one because she has waited so long. Magda. Sorry, John. If you want to.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So just regarding the McKinley debate, on March 30th, I'll give a presentation for Rising Tide Foundation on this whole history of imperialism, I guess you can call it. Okay. And I will touch on this issue of McKinley. So anyway, but that's in the future. I wanted to raise, and I also wanted to thank you for laying the groundwork so nicely. We had here in Canada, since this whole debate of tariffs is coming up, we had a big uproar among the population of Canada that we are supposed to now buy Canadian. Okay. So
Yeah.
Canadian, we have now little signs in the grocery stores, Canadian product, and so forth and so on. So there's a big, I don't know, public sentiment about this, I guess you can call it. Okay. The other day I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and she was telling me that her husband is a cottage maker. Okay. And I said, oh, okay. So, and she said, I don't know what the future for him looks like. And I'm going like, well, but isn't the whole that wood comes from Canada, right? She said, well, but what about the rest of it? Like the faucets and the toilets and the pipes and the this and the that. And I'm going like, oh, okay. So now we're seeing kind of a recognition among the population of Canada that we actually need to produce our own things. We just, shouldn't just import constantly because we're the biggest importer of American goods and Chinese goods, okay? But that we actually should produce something ourselves. And then the other day, maybe about a week ago or so, okay, Prime Minister Trudeau and make an announcement that they want to build a high-speed railroad from Quebec City all the way to Toronto and maybe even go over to Windsor, Detroit, maybe. Okay, that's what I was thinking. But anyway, so and I was very excited about this. And then I saw right over. Then I was looking and waiting for reactions. And there was no reaction to this announcement.
Yes.
I mean,
Are you
like,
going to build
literally,
anything?
no
Right.
reaction. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm going like, why is there no reaction? People should be excited. This is finally something that we're doing. Okay. That the leadership in Canada is now saying we should be doing this. Okay. And I'm going like, that's very strange, right? No reaction, okay? And then I'm also thinking about what you proposed earlier about the native population. We have Indian reservations in Canada that have water boiling advisory for over 27 years.
You have what?
Water boiling advisories from
Oh,
the
yes.
government.
They have to boil the water because
You
it's
have
not
to
pure.
boiling the water so you can drink
Yeah.
the water and you can
Yeah, so
use
you
the
don't
water
die.
for
Yeah,
over 27 years.
right.
Okay, and what's that about?
All
Right?
right. So,
And I'm going, so there's all these opportunities now popping up, and we need to move on. So anyway, what do
all
you
right.
think?
So you've raised two very good points, really. Uh, it's obvious that you're going to have really modern 21st century powerful infrastructure if you want to really have production in Canada and have people buy Canadian, right? You have to do things to alter nature. Uh, and so that's one thing. So you're going to have to give up certain kinds of insanity, of Malthusian ideology to get anything to buy from Canada. But the other thing is about the United States and China. I would ask people in Canada to play a role that is a little different politically on the international level. And that is, look at the United States with a critical eye. How can you be critical of the United States? Well, one reason that it's difficult to be seriously critical of the United States is that many of the things that the United States has done wrong has been in partnership with Canada. The wars, in particular, the foreign wars that are evil. I'm not talking about, the famous crusade against Hitler. I'm talking about all these later wars, right? But if you want to really be critical of the United States, there's only one way to do it seriously and with deeper understanding. And that is, you have to contrast the evil, the crimes that are being committed by the United States or have been committed in the past, contrast them with what the United States did to influence and advance civilization in a miraculous way. You have to contrast this evil with what's you have to appreciate the accomplishments of really of Western civilization at all, America in particular. There's very few people that can honestly criticize the United States today. And I say that because they don't appreciate what the United States did that was good, to contrast it with the crime after crime committed in the name of the United States. I mean, it's similar to many other issues, right? Of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and so forth. But let Canadians demand of the United States that it live up to the great past that it had. They hesitate to do that because that they think that they're endorsing slavery or something. Well, Canada was good about taking escaped slaves, but Canada also was the host for the Confederate action team that murdered Lincoln. Just like the action team of the fascists, for Montague Norman and Morgan, and some Canadian bankers were involved, Canadian figures were involved in this. This is a roundtable. So you're not off the hook for that, for the crimes of America. But you can't, it's time for other countries, their leaders and their people, to demand and hope and pray for the United States to go back to acting for the benefit of their own people and foreigners. For the benefit of human beings instead of committing crimes. We need help from other countries to press upon us this recognition of what we've done, and what's good about the United States, to contrast it with this problem. That's what I would say. Then this whole thing will sort itself out. One of the good things that America did was it stood up for its own people, bought its own products, and developed its own industry. So Canada should do that too. But they don't have to become enemies of some other country. The same thing with China. Why won't you recognize what the great, magnificent accomplishments of China? You want to criticize China? You want to criticize the Communist Party of China? Be my guest. But you can't do that honestly unless you're recognizing that 5,000 years of their history. Communism and autocracy did not start with Mao Zedong. You had the legalists, you had other people, you had, people that cut off the heads of their opponents. You had kings, or what do you call emperors, who gave up any contact with foreigners. You had this problem, but you also had, the inventions that shaped the whole world. So recognize this beauty in the past of other people. Recognize, people that might be able to criticize something about you. They might be in a position to do that. America might, and you can criticize them. I think that's all the time I have time for. I got to get back
Thank
to
you,
work
Tony.
here. Thank you.
Thank you from everybody here today. Thank you so much.
Thanks everybody for this class.